The driving force for me for a long time since I was a medical student has been an acute discomfort with the level of ignorance that we have in healthcare delivery. That is, we're increasingly focused on engineering, which is iterative improvement of the delivery of something, but getting much less attention is the fact that very often, in fact the vast majority of the time, we don't know what it is we're supposed to be delivering because we don't know which one out of the alternatives is better. And to me, these are very different things. Engineering is something that we really can learn from other industries, knowing which is better in healthcare because it deals with such timescales and choices, and confounding is a whole different activity that is still losing ground as far as I'm concerned. So I feel like since I've been a medical student, I've been running as fast as I can to generate evidence. And the gap and the need for generating evidence is growing so much faster than our ability to generate it that we've got to come up with a better system. So I'm going to give you this, my side of the story on where this currently resides. So this is sort of my mantra. High percentage of decisions not supported by evidence. Health outcomes and disparities in the U.S. are, if they are improving, it's only very modestly. You and I live in the part of the country which is bearing up the rear end of healthcare disparities and continues to do so at an alarming rate. So you could, and the current system of generating the evidence for what to do is really tremendous, except it's too slow, too expensive, and not reliable, and doesn't answer the questions that matter most to patients, and is extraordinarily and increasingly unattractive to clinicians and administrators. Other than that, it's a great system. So the question would be, what can you do to try to fix it? This is just a month in the Califf family, and like many of you, we're all connected by Facebook and other social media. So, you know, these are questions that came up in 1 month, right when we were preparing the PPR slides pertaining to my family. Does the Motrin that you're taking for pain increase your risk of heart attacks? It probably does, but we have no idea how much. And increasing evidence that it may be just as bad as Celebrex, for example. But how do you know what to do for things that are already over the counter? Had a daughter-in-law getting ready to, pregnant with a baby, goes in to get her ultrasound. They say you got a short cervix. That means you're high risk for premature delivery. And we've got this thing called bed rest that we always recommend. Of course, they don't call it bed rest now, they call it restricted activity. But you know, she has a great job running, managing the interface for a not-for-profit that funds startup corporations in Colorado, and it'd be pretty disruptive to not go to work. And so she asked the question, how do you know that this will help? And they said, we don't know, but it's what we recommend. And I went and looked it up, and the Cochrane collaboration says we have no earthly idea. They accumulated all the evidence. So here's something happening to millions of women every day in the U.S., a very common recommendation. No idea what the right answer is. I'm a two-drug hypertension guy now. Should my medicine be taken in the morning or at night? I don't know, but there are a lot of people who have strong opinions about it, and it would be nice to know the answer to that question. And I have a relative with ADHD, or at least diagnosed that way. What are the real risks and benefits of being on a sympathomimetic drug for years and years? Don't know. This is ignorance. And if you look up ignorance in the dictionary or Wikipedia, it's not just not knowing something, it's willfully not knowing something. And I would argue that these are all very answerable questions. They involve millions of people. We're collecting electronic data every time there's an interaction with these people, and yet for some reason we choose to remain ignorant. So I'll say more about that in a minute. I was about 5 years ago, I was intoxicated with how great we were in cardiology. We're the evidence-based specialty compared to the rest. So poor Pier Luigi Tricosi came from Italy to do his fellowship, and we said, we're going to make you famous because we've got a contract with the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association. We're going to look and see what percentage of our recommendations are based on high quality evidence, and we're going to blow everybody out of the water with how evidence-based we are. Little did we know that Pier Luigi would become the poster child for Obamacare. So I actually got to go to the White House twice to participate as a physician in the indoctrination by Zika manual, and this slide showed up in every presentation because what we documented was that 85% of our major recommendations are not supported by high quality evidence, and half of our major recommendations are level C, which means it's just a bunch of gray-haired or balding doctors who have an opinion but no evidence at all really to support what they're recommending. So the Obama administration used this as a reason why we needed organized healthcare, because we're pretty ignorant about what we're doing. This is just one of many disparity slides I should show, and I think the two things about this slide I like to show. The first is that men are in bad shape. I understand you have a big men's health grant here at UAB, and I congratulate you. We need a lot more of those. But the other is if you're a black man in America, your odds, your life expectancy is over 20 years shorter than an Asian woman. And this is really an intolerable state of disparity, which accounts for a lot of our general ranking in the world, which I don't know if you all saw it, but Michael Porter's ranking that came out again about 3 months ago, we're now ranked number 70 in health status. And I forget the name of the countries we're sandwiched between, but they're not countries you would normally want to be associated with as an American in terms of status. All right, so what do we do about it? And I think where things are going was actually presaged, and this part of it I think is kind of fun, at least historically. In around 2002, when Elias Zerhouni became NIH director, he came from a business background, so like all good business people, he wanted to develop a strategic plan, and they called it the roadmap. So they took many of the big grantees, put them all in a room together, divided into some groups, decided on priorities, and used typical consultant slides to depict the plan. And I was in the clinical research group, and this axis is level of difficulty, and that axis is time. If you start at 2002, you can't see it here, but the time axis was 10 years. And what we thought at the time in 2002, we're on the path to every American having an electronic health record. The way we currently do clinical research is really stupid. It's so slow and expensive and inefficient. By 2012 or 13, we should have a national clinical research system that creates effectiveness data that moves rapidly into the community and data on outcomes and quality of care. It should be a sustained, efficient infrastructure that could rapidly initiate large clinical trials and provide scientific information for patients, families, and advocacy groups, thinking at the time that advocacy groups will become a really major part of the culture of research. Well, what's interesting to me about this slide is if you look at the building blocks to getting to where we thought it would go, the technology has completely happened. And I would argue that all of the impediments now are cultural, they're not technological. But the elements are there. We have 6,000 patient advocacy groups in the US, and if you want to see first-class research, you go to Cystic Fibrosis Foundation or the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, not to the NIH, because there you have the patients already signed up looking for research to participate in to help find the best treatment for the problems that they have. So that's a bit of history. And this is a slide that came from that. The concept, one of the concepts being that in the old world, you had coordinating centers that would run clinical trials, and you had research sites that were really sort of dumb participants that were paid some money to enroll patients. We've evolved to maybe you have two coordinating centers that can actually share data, as scary as that sounds. But the ultimate goal was to create something that looks more like a neural network where everybody gets to be smart and participate in understanding what the data means. And you don't have command and control centers as coordinating centers. Now, keep in mind that there's nothing that's been better for my career than the fact that we have an impossible system to navigate in the US, because the few of us who know how to do it do extraordinarily well, and we do have command and control. It dawned on me very early in my career that if you ran the coordinating center and you had the database, you had all the power. And sure, there are problems and issues you have to deal with, but ultimately you're the one interpreting the data and controlling the analyses that are done. So what we envisioned in 2002 was a much more democratic system, and we'll talk about how that's evolving, and you'll have to tell me where it's going to end up, because I'm really not sure. I could see it going one of two very radically different directions. So the missing link is this agile, efficient infrastructure. It just doesn't exist in the US. One could argue that that's true of the US as a whole in almost everything, particularly healthcare delivery. And it's a legitimate question: do you want an agile, efficient infrastructure? Because you might get answers that you don't like, especially if you make your money delivering healthcare, which is not really oriented towards health, but towards a payment system that pays to do things in a particular way that may or may not be good for people. So the counter then it would be the learning health system. And I've got a whole series of articles I'm working on. I may never get to finishing them, but it's a comparison of the ignorant health system and the learning health system. And I would argue, if you go and make rounds at our best academic centers today, by and large, you're seeing an ignorant health system. You're seeing doctors stumbling through clinics and inpatient services, trying to get through the day, heads down, trying to get data entered into Epic, and getting very little back in a way that's actionable. And it's a fact that 80% of doctors globally now, when they have a question, do a straight Google search exactly like what the patients are doing. So hard to argue that we're advancing the learning health system in practice. But I will say, and you know, I'm guilty of this, the construct and the intellectual activity in describing a learning health system, I think it's gotten very advanced, and I think generally it's right. It's something that we need to aspire to. This is the classical group health slide that appeared in the Annals of Internal Medicine a couple of years ago. And you know, I would argue it's no different than the Walmart system. You know, instead of a patient coming in, what you got is a customer coming in. Every transaction is recorded electronically. It goes into a database that allows good analysts to help make the next transaction better. That's the way business works in the US today. But for a variety of reasons, we just haven't gotten the feedback loop operational in medicine. So when the RFA came out for the Healthcare Systems Research Collaboratory, as Ken alluded to, several of us were really excited, because this described an effort by the NIH to do something experimental that could begin to make a segue into a different way of thinking about how evidence is generated. This is an effort which is part of what's called the Common Fund. No reason for you to remember this, but it'll help explain why it's working the way it is. One thing Zerhouni did was to say, you know, we have these 26 institutes at the NIH. Each one, because of the way the US works, is almost solely interested in its disease or organ system of interest. But if you have things that need to be done across everything, there's no mechanism for doing that. So the Common Fund is essentially a discretionary fund that comes from taxing the institutes that's under the purview of the NIH director. And the way the money gets spent, I think, is a lot of fun. And if you ever get invited to one of these meetings, you should definitely go to it. But what they do is they have focus groups where they bring together grantees from all different fields, and they just throw them together. And you have to come to the meeting with your 3 best ideas for something that's high risk, that no single institute would do, that the NIH should try. And then as a group, everybody presents their ideas, and you take iterative votes until you end up with only 3 ideas out of the group of about 30 people. And then you present those 3 ideas to the NIH director. And then something magical and secret happens behind the scenes, and they come out with what they're going to put money into. But by design, these programs are meant to sunset in 5 to 7 years. If they're successful, they should be instantiated into the NIH, and if they're unsuccessful, they should go away. So I like this, and I think it's a way of taking a system that has a lot of legacy inhibiting factors and moving ahead. So the idea in the Healthcare Systems Research Collaboratory was think of important clinical questions that can be answered with a pragmatic design where electronic health record can be used as a core data collection instrument, and at least 2 integrated health systems claim that they're willing to work together. Amazingly enough, Rich Platt and I are sharing the coordinating activity here, and in the first round they had over 80 applications and funded 7. And it's been fascinating to me. We're now in year sort of 2.5. And what they decided to do was to use the first year as what they call a UH2 to UH3 mechanism. That means the funded projects got a year of pretty good funding to show that what they could do could actually be done and to work through the many issues that we knew we would face. And then there's a review, and if they're good enough, they go forward. This is not radically different than some other pilot mechanisms, but it's a very formal way of starting out with some good ideas and trying to perfect them. I initially thought of this as the Hunger Games because at the beginning it was clear all 7 were not going to, there wasn't enough money, but NIH has found enough money to fund 6 out of the 7. So we're doing pretty well in terms of the Hunger Games part of this. It's hard to get people to work together when they're looking at each other thinking, I got to beat the guy next to me. How am I going to collaborate and share knowledge about how to do things? But you can see the list of projects here. One of them that didn't get the money going forward is actually the one that's most pertinent to me. That's the blood pressure question. Should you take your medicine at night or day? But I think we're going to get that funded through another mechanism. It's such an important question. But there's some pretty amazing trials in here. One of them that's one of my favorites is the question of how do you prevent suicide? So the problem in the US, of course, is that most people who commit suicide are not seeing a psychiatrist. They're seeing some kind of primary care person. And that primary care person has a lot of other things to worry about and would have no way of being up to date on the latest way to intercept a potential suicide. But a very large proportion of people are filling out little PROs essentially in the office. And there's some pretty good scores now to predict risk of suicidality. But the question is, so the design is to randomize practices to one of 3 interventions in a cluster randomized design. But the question is, how do you get consent from, you're essentially calling people up based on a scan of 40 million electronic medical records and saying, we think you've got a problem, would you like some help? And we've been through, Greg Simon at Group Health is leading this project, and just last week we finally reached the point where we, together with the IRB, they've developed a mechanism where about 70% of people in the pilot studies will agree to enter the clinical trial. So a lot of interesting things to work through. It's hard to think of any other way to answer this question than have a large sampling reference and then randomize the practitioners, not the individual patients. But we still need consent from the patients according to US standards. One I'd like to highlight, which is well underway, is called the TIME trial. And this just totally blows people away when I say it if they're not knowledgeable about it. But you would think with all the money made on dialysis in the US today, we would have some idea what the proper length of a dialysis run should be. And it turns out we have no earthly idea. Current standard is set by some manipulation of what it costs and what people are willing to pay and some idea of sort of historical frames of references of nephrologists. So Laura Denber, amazingly enough, has gotten Davidia and Fresenius to work together, the 2 for-profit dialysis companies that own over 80% of the dialysis units in the US. And they're cluster randomizing practices to either longer dialysis runs or standard. And that's well underway. It appears to be working. The endpoint of this trial is death. So it's a total mortality trial being done for about $5 million because they're able to use the records of these two companies without collecting additional data hardly at all to answer the question. And one of the interesting sidelights here as we get towards the ethics issue, it's fascinating to know that you have a trial where total mortality is the primary endpoint, but the IRB has deemed that it's minimal risk. Okay, hold that thought. All right, so then we have PPR comes on the scene, and I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly because it tells a story. PPR actually began with a retreat that was held at Stanford. It was attended by a lot of different federal agencies and academics. And the question is, what can PPR do to make a difference in a big way dealing with big data? And Francis Collins got very excited about this from the NIH perspective, and actually this is his slide from that retreat. Said, what if we could bring 20 to 30 million people together with a broad representative population and have 80 or 90% of those people participating and had longitudinal follow-up. That's an infrastructure that the NIH could use, industry could use it, and PPR, if it survives the politics, could also use in the long term. So based on this retreat, PPR then came out with what they call a PFA for a new national network that would sort of meet these Francis Collins criteria. I think all of you are familiar with PPR in this room, so I won't dwell on it, but you're aware that PPR has a strategic plan. It's politically a very difficult position that PPR is in because it's officially part of Obamacare, and that makes it a target for a lot of people. And amazingly enough, it's a new source of about $600 million a year in research money, but the pay line is below 15% already because there's so many researchers out there who have things they'd like to do. So the goal of this network it's really an infrastructure goal. It's to improve the capacity to conduct clinical research. And this has been one of the difficult things in coordinating it. As academics, we like to do the research and get the answers. Being the highway on which somebody else's car goes is not a glorious academic activity, but it's absolutely necessary, and we still haven't really reached, honestly, the middle ground here on how to fulfill both missions, answering questions, but also helping other people answer their questions. So the vision then would be rapid, large-scale, patient-centered research in real-world delivery systems. And these are the methods that we're trying to use to go about it. Create infrastructure, use multiple electronic sources, and I can't tell you, I think many of you in the room know, despite what some people would lead you to believe, it's not a pretty sight when you use electronic sources. You got to know a lot to make it work, and we've got a lot of people who sent beautiful written applications in who are learning a lot right now about what they didn't know, including me. A key feature of this is engaging patients, which is fundamental to the mission of PPR. And the other thing, which I want to stress again, I can't say it enough, this is not just for PPR's use, because it's almost for certain that PPR won't have enough money to sustain the network. It's going to have to be attractive to NIH investigators and to industry in order to be a sustained effort. So the competition went out. We won the coordinating center for this, and it's been an interesting link between the Collaboratory, which is experimental, high risk, meant to go away in 5 to 7 years, and PPR, which is meant to be an enduring network. So we're learning on both sides, and it's been unusual and great to have the NIH backing someone else's network to such a large extent. So the turfism that often exists between federal agencies is really not a problem in this network. But turfism among academic centers remains an issue that I'm sure you all recognize. So we ended up with 11 so-called CDRNs and 18 patient-powered research networks, broadly distributed throughout the United States. For those of you who live in CTSA world, 60 of the 62 CTSAs have either a PPRN or a CDRN. So tremendous overlap of these two infrastructure elements or bureaucracies, depending on how you want to look at it. And there's a lot at stake in trying to figure out how to get them to, these two elements to work together as opposed to having divisive systems in the same institutions. The configuration is such that all the major feds are participating. FDA is completely behind this, NIH, as I've already said, but major representation by CMS, ONC, ARC, of course, and CDC. But we also have industry at the table, and it's built into PCORI that industry has a seat, major seat on the board. And as we go through this, we're thinking about how to meld the needs of industry into this. So there's an executive committee, then we have the networks, and over on the right-hand side you see the task forces. And I'm just going to give you a glimpse of what the task forces are grappling with. But in official lexicon, we now look at PCORI months as dog years. The PCORI board in its wisdom gave us 18 months to make this network functional. And every month that goes by is equivalent of about 4 months or 5 months of normal activity. It's a little scary, but we just met with the board and we thought they had some wise reason for picking 18 months to make it functional. It turned out they didn't. They were sort of wondering, why are you doing this in 18 months? And we said, because that's the funding that you gave us. So that's the way things work in Washington, I guess. And so there's a very purposeful composition, though, to try to bring everybody to the table during this design phase. So what is a CDRN? To be a CDRN, you had to say in your application that you had 1 million patients or more, that you were committed to involve patients, practitioners, and health system leaders. You had to have a letter signed by your CEO committing. And I think all of you who have gotten letters signed by people like chairs of medicine know that a high percentage are not read. I'm pretty convinced that most CEOs didn't actually read what they signed in this case, because they were really signing something that said, we're going to offer up our data for other researchers to use from other systems, and we're committed to do it. And we had to develop the ability to embed clinical trials into healthcare operations. And then there was a commitment to identify 3 cohorts in this planning phase as examples that you could actually do what you said you could do. And we ended up, they were only going to fund 9, they funded 11 because they were so impressed with the applications at PCORI. And these are sort of non-trivial groups. Just as a couple examples, Capricorn is the whole city of Chicago. Don't ask me how they're all going to work together, but they're making good progress at this point. NYC CDRN is the whole city of New York. Bloomberg, before he finished his term, paid for them to meet every day for 3 months to put their application together. And these are institutions that are typically competing in a major way who have agreed to collaborate. P-Scanner is the 5 major University of California health systems linked with the entire VA system. And again, these are mammoth organizations. If you add up the total number of people that were in the applications, it's 100 million. So it's about 1/3 of America potentially at play in this effort. Now, this may shock you to know, but there is a skill to grantsmanship in big grants where sometimes you may say things that are not really quite true. I don't think we're going to have 100 million. Rich Platt would say 10 million would be plenty. That's all he would promise, but it'll be somewhere between those two when we're up and going. And this is just a look at the cohorts that people picked. Common diseases and rare diseases. there's a lot of overlap. So the work on this is well underway. The PPR Ends, which you have one centered here at Alabama, were required to, and this is a whole new thing. In a way, these are modeled after the most advanced patient advocacy groups like cystic fibrosis or multiple myeloma. But a network like this, to my knowledge, had never been funded by an agency. So we're sort of making it up as we go. But the idea was establish a patient population, depending on the disease, having about 5% of the population in the U.S. with the disease, collect PROs, and develop a governance system where the patients have a major say. I won't dwell on this, but it's a very interesting social interaction that's going on in these PPR Ends. Some of them are very advanced at collecting information totally outside the organized health system. And one of the most challenging things for the coordinating center right now is what happens if you've been collecting health-related data totally freely on the internet, and now you want to do research in an environment where you're governed by the common rule. I don't think we figured it out yet exactly how to navigate this, but several of our PPRs have said they'd have to go out of business because the cost of the infrastructure you need to have all the assurances that are required by HIPAA and the common rule are pretty substantial. This is a look at the PPR Ends. It's a pretty broad spectrum of problems. For me, it's been like a textbook of medicine, a really interesting chance to learn. These are the more common problems. And then some of these things I hadn't really thought about a lot. I'm sure at Alabama, under Seth's leadership, everyone knows what Lennox-Gastaut syndrome is, or Phelan-McDermott, but this is sort of new stuff for me. But you never met a more effective bureaucracy buster than the mother of a child with one of these genetic diseases who's saying, you know, my kid is dying, why does your IRB take 6 months and your contracting take a year? I think the mix here, if we can figure it out, is going to be very dynamic and combustible. So patients are involved in every element of this. One of our task forces that I won't dwell on is the Clinical Trials Task Force. And I had never really thought much about, you know, if you think of the phases of a clinical trial, how patients should be involved in the analysis phase of a clinical trial. But we're going to have patients sitting at the table with the statisticians when the analyses are done and the interpretations are done. A lot of interesting ideas are bubbling up about how to do this. Our job in the coordinating center is pretty simple, as shown here. The networks are doing all the work. Our job is to try to help figure out what's common and to create avenues where people can get things done. All right, so this is from what we showed to the board just last week. I'd be lying if I said this was easy. Jeff already mentioned that in his PPRN, he's spending a little more time than the effort being paid for, Seth. Maybe in multiples, actually, but I think that's true for everybody working on this project. But I would say, you know, we're making really good progress here, and it's fascinating. We're having meetings of CEOs of health systems, and probably doesn't surprise you to hear that they're very focused on quarterly P&L sheets. They would love to see research done, but they're struggling to see exactly how they can fit it into an agenda where they're increasingly pressured for short-term finances. But we're working on it. There's a whole governance system. If you think about some of these networks, I'll just pick on one of them is Hopkins, Pittsburgh, Penn State, and Temple. They all have one network. Well, Hopkins is now a $9.5 billion health system. Pitt is a $13 billion health system. Altogether, there's something like 30 million people cared for in their health systems. If they choose to do a study, when is it a PCORNet study and when is it a study that Hopkins or Pitt would just do on its own? And none of this is settled. We're having to make it up as we go. For people who think that you can press a button and get useful information out of an electronic health record for research, there's some really hard lessons being learned here, but we're working on that. I'll show you a little bit more. This one is the one I'm actually most worried about. I think the group that's hardest to actually get to right now are practicing healthcare providers and administrators at the local level. They just are overwhelmed and busy. And unless you have money to defray the cost of the effort they have to put in, it's very hard to get them engaged. And then I'm going to show you about the regulatory ethics part, which is I'm not worried about it in the sense of theoretically impossible. I'm worried about it that due to things that are happening, it could turn out to be a huge problem over the next year. This is a look at the 11 task forces. Each one has a lot of work to do to figure out how to make this happen. And just a word about the ethics. And there's a really interesting phenomenon. You can tell by my orientation, I've gone into this believing that we have a big problem. And it's not a problem because we're doing terribly compared to history. It's a problem because the gap between what we could be doing in generating evidence and what we're doing is so big. And technically, there's no impediment to closing that gap. But I've learned that there are many, many people who think there is no problem, including a number of IRB chairs and ethicists who are not stupid people. They're very smart. And they point out that for everything that a researcher might regard as an impediment, there's a historical reason why it's there. Bad things have been done, and it's pretty easy to enumerate the bad things that have been done. And so you got to prevent harm to research subjects. And there's an ethic out there which academic centers have helped to perpetuate, which is arguable. And the ethic is that when you're in a doctor-patient relationship, the doctor is totally devoted in a fiduciary manner, that is, as a primary interest, the well-being of the patient. Whereas when you're in a research relationship, you're an object to the researcher, and the researcher only wants the answer to the question. And many of us who believe in learning would say that that's an old-fashioned paradigm that, first of all, isn't true on face value, because all doctors now, or almost all, work for big corporations, many of which are called academic medical centers, that make decisions that doctors really can't deviate from unless they want to go at risk of losing their jobs. But in addition to that, the best doctors, I believe, are people who say, I don't really know, and I am duty-bound to find out, and I want you to help me to do that as a patient. And so the doctor becomes the investigator as a normal part of the job, just like we think about quality improvement. But these are two contrasting views, and it is not settled in the world of organized ethics. Wally has become an expert on this, and I have enjoyed getting to know Wally because of the support trial. Because I'm involved in a lot of policies here, I've ended up getting involved with the network that he's been involved in. And all of you should be activated by the fact that University of Alabama is going to be setting a precedent through the court case that's currently underway on several critical issues here. It'll be played out probably in a very public way in a court of law, which I would argue is not the best place to do it. But if it's going to happen, we'd better be on our toes and making sure that we do it well. I love this term, research exceptionalism. And this is a term the Brits have coined. There's a great literature on it now. And the way I think about it, a simple way to consider this is, let's say you're a surgeon and you want to do a better job with the operation. If you say, I'm going to do a quality improvement project and I'm going to use really lousy methods, like I'm just going to look at a series and draw a conclusion based on what I think would have been there, you can do that and call it quality improvement. There's no oversight other than the local clinical operation. But if you said, I really want to learn from this, in a way that I can be sure I'm getting the right answer. So I'm going to use a randomized paradigm, and I'm going to collect really good data and use the best methods. Now it becomes research. And now you've got to be overseen by the IRB, and you've got many, many people questioning what you're doing. So we're actually encouraging bad learning by imposing a system in one sphere which is burdensome, and then in another sphere allowing substandard poor methods to be used as a routine. That's at least my story, and I'm sticking to it. What's happened with this through the, first of all, with the collaboratory for the trials that I showed you, in order to launch these projects, we had to have a separate conference call on each project with OHRP. So it had already been through the local IRBs, but we had to specifically get this through OHRP because there was so much concern about precedent setting from the way we were doing these trials. Most of them are cluster randomized. Many of them do not have consent. Many of them only get consent after the experiment is started, because in a cluster randomized trial, it's not feasible to get consent from every individual. So what happened is, I thought initially we could sort of come up with policies about ethics and regulation for the networks. They would go through a system that might take a couple of months, but we immediately hit a roadblock because there was not agreement among ethics and IRB experts and patients about what should happen. And so we've now stepped back with some generous funding, I'll have to say, from the NIH, to form 11 groups. I don't know why everything's in 11, but 11 groups that are going to spend 7 months arguing about each of these questions, which are central to having a functioning system. And one thing I've learned is that even among experts, people know very little about the history. How many of you know about the history of minimal risk, where that came from? You know how you have to get minimal risk determination to waive consent? It actually was an argument between a Protestant and a Catholic theologian related to the famous investigator who was inoculating orphan children with hepatitis B about 40 years ago. And there was an argument that went on between these theologians for a number of years, and then they coined the term minimal risk to capture the concept that if the risk is no more than would have occurred in normal life, then it's okay, and you don't have to go through the normal standard consenting process. Well, it turns out there's no agreement among IRBs about what constitutes minimal risk. Ethicists disagree. The same arguments have been going on for years. So step one is just in plain English that lay people can understand, to write out the history and the arguments that are being used for one position or another. Then 7 months from now, we'll be ready to make recommendations. This is about a 40% effort for me alone to help try to make this happen. And we also concluded this is one place where conference calls are almost totally useless. Getting the patients, the IRB chairs, the ethicists, and the investigators at a table face-to-face is probably the only way to resolve these issues. I'll move along here in the interest of time, but quickly, what resources will we have 13 months from now when we're supposed to be ready to go? One thing we decided is we need to have a weight cohort as an example of what could be done. This started as an obesity cohort, but in all the discussions about how it would be perceived, the decision was made to call it a weight cohort. And it actually, the task force behind this was the obesity task force. The biggest problem we've actually had with this, it became the weight task force, which stands for WTF. And it just didn't cut it. As so we've got the obesity task force and the weight cohort going on. Quick word about privacy. This is just an unbelievably enormous issue right now. We couldn't have picked a worse time to be proposing to come out with pragmatic clinical trials that either may not require consent at all or may be okay with a minimal consent. Mr. Snowden didn't do us any favors here. And so we're very involved in systems to deal with privacy. Rich probably talked about this a lot, so I think I'll skip over it. Rich claims this is actually him. And the general concept, where we can, the idea is to not move the data, but to answer the questions behind each institutional firewall and then aggregate the results. But the problem, of course, with that is for many questions that require not only aggregation of data, but also transparency for the public good to make data sets available to assure people that we're not biased in our analyses, we're still going to have to come up with methods to put data in a common place. I won't go through this in detail. Also point out that the American system is fragmented in many ways. The ideal electronic system would combine all these different sources into something that's understandable, and we're a long ways from being there. Each individual element has strengths and weaknesses. No one alone is really adequate to do high quality research for many of the questions that need to be answered. How many of you have heard the term computable phenotype? A few. This is really, what an epidemiologist would call a description of a cohort, but because we're using electronic records and the NIH is involved, we had to use the word phenotype. And computable just means that there are a set of codes you can use to identify a group of people who actually represent the population that you're interested in. But what's amazing about this, as you can imagine, we have something like 60 cohorts already that are being looked at. What's amazing is how different the population can be depending on just small variations in codes. And even with the same codes in different health systems, you end up with different proportions of patients. This is a paper we've recently published about our own health system with diabetes, type 2 diabetes. You'd think we'd know what type 2 diabetes is clinically, but it turns out you can end up with a twofold variation in the proportion of people who are thought to have type 2 diabetes, just depending on which codes you use. And these are all published, validated codes. So a lot of work going on to try to rationalize being able to do things electronically without having to collect primary data, which is so expensive. And then finally, there's a clinical trial that we're going to start shortly. This is actually one I've been trying to do for 25 years, so I'm really excited about it. 100 years after aspirin has been on the market, we still don't know the right dose for preventing cardiovascular disease. There are a lot of interesting opinions, but there's no head-to-head trial. So we said, even in this planning phase, let's do one clinical trial that would allow everyone to test out their systems to see how they work. And we had a bake-off. Every network submitted our proposal. And the winner, the aspirin trial, is not because it's necessarily a better trial, but it's one that's applicable to so many people and where most of the outcomes probably can be ascertained by an electronic health record. But just to give you an idea, these were the 6 finalists that made it into it. You'll recognize some topics that are of keen interest to a lot of people trying to provide health care today. So this trial hopefully will be launched in the near future. The PCORI board just approved it last week. And we got $10 million to do a 20,000 patient trial. So it'll be a good test of whether we really can do things more efficiently by using automated systems. And then the very last thing to mention is, where is all this going? I do think, despite all the problems that I've enumerated, it's really clear that, when 300 million Americans have electronic records, and with the other technology, there's a tipping point in sight now where it will be pretty, I won't say simple, but it will be possible to aggregate the information in meaningful ways and not only combine the medical data, but also combine it with all the other data that's out there in society. And we've had a chance to do that locally, and I think it's actually working. So if you begin to think about pragmatic clinical trials now, not as necessarily based in a clinic or a hospital, but based in a neighborhood or a school, you begin to think about ways you can impact health that would integrate the traditional medical system with the other things that we know are so important. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that's given you an idea of where we currently are. Sorry if I gave you too many problems to deal with. So?
Rob, I'd be curious about your thoughts about the role of doctors in this stuff. Accessing these data and manipulating them is highly technical, very sophisticated, and takes a lot of training, a lot of work. It may get simpler. Should we be training physician investigators to actually be knee deep in that, or is this going to become? What do you think of the role of the academic physician of doctors in really getting to know working with these data?
Yes, I'll try to reel off a couple things quickly about this. It's a hot button issue with me, as I already alluded to. First, what I'd say is that there are people trying to bypass the doctor, and Ken and I had a good discussion with his group about that already in a trial he's trying to do. Historically, that has been a bad strategy, and I think it's still a bad strategy because when people get sick especially, they actually want to have, whether we call it a doctor or a provider, whoever the right person is providing health care. So I think they need to be included. But we're doing a really bad job in medical school of training what I would call level 1, which is everybody practicing should have a commitment to research and learning as a normal part of practice. But we're graduating most medical students with no clue about that. They're being trained to consume evidence but not to generate it, and I think that's a major problem. But the bright spot for academic centers, in my view, is if you look at what's happening in America, we're consolidating into about 250 health systems. Almost everyone either has or wants to have a medical school. And you got to ask, what should these medical schools be doing? And I would say the most important task of the future is to train people to deal with data and information. And there we're not, it's an opportunity because we're doing a lousy job of that also right now. But the information's going to be there, and the question is, how do you use it to make good decisions? I did have a great talk with your CEO of the health system today, and there's some interesting things. You have an amazing opportunity here because of this crazy Medicaid thing that North Carolina and Alabama are doing with not expanding. But the plan you're going to give should give your researchers an amazing opportunity to understand the analytical levers to pull to optimize the balance between finance and health outcomes. But I think our major academic role, I don't know what, it's good to train biological sciences PhDs, we still need that, but we need to really rev up the information knowledge-based training that we do. Yes?
Sort of piggybacking off of that, how are you engaging the patients at the analytic level? I mean, that seems like a fantastic idea in theory, but then the average patient, breaking it down to a level that they can understand during that process. Is there some sort of training that all patients should go through if you have this condition and you want to understand what's going on?
Yeah, so two or three quick things about that. First of all, I don't purport to be the expert for sure. But I think what I've learned so far in this, first of all, there are some advocacy groups now that are leading the way and showing how you can do this. The Breast Cancer Coalition is probably the best at this. And they have training programs for patients who want to learn. Secondly, it is a mistake, we've learned, to plop a patient down in the middle of a discussion about how to analyze data. You have to think ahead of time and give them an orientation. There are also many patients who have PhDs in non-medical fields who are perfectly capable, but in general, knowing your patient reps for things like analysis is important, and you have to think ahead about what the orientation plan should be. But the most interesting thing is when a patient says, explain this to me in plain English, what I think I've learned is that is a useful exercise in every case. Because we use shorthand for things, and we're assuming that our fellow professionals understand what we're really trying to say, but often we don't. And when you have to explain it in plain English, it sometimes leads to a different view or a different way of thinking about it. Now, the whole corpus of patients out there, that's a daunting task. I'll leave that to other smarter people to figure out.
All right, well, Rob, thanks very much. Great
You bet.
discussion.